So, my name's Matt. I work with GreenPoint as a member of our sales organization and had sent out the invites. So I appreciate you guys taking the time to check this out and attend this webinar with us. We're excited to get your feedback afterwards. This is the second in a series. So in the first section, we talked about the ways that climate-related financial risk is impacting borrowers' business models and as a result, the bank's liquidity position. In this session, we're going to talk about the ways that we're helping our clients include those risks in their liquidity risk framework. So I am going to step out of the way here and let Marcus take over, and then I'll be hopping on later on to do some polling and Q&A at the end. But again, I really appreciate you guys taking the time. Happy to have everybody here.
Hey, thank you, Matt. And welcome from me to everyone who's taken time out of their day to join us for this webinar. My name is Marcus Cree. I am the Managing Director of GreenPoint Financial. Okay, so let's jump in and let's just remind ourselves as to why we're here at this second webinar. In the first, as mentioned, we discussed how policies are in the process of rolling through, notably through the IRA in the US. But they are rolling through, which will have a definitive impact on businesses that make up the borrowers, particularly the commercial borrowers, but actually all on bank balance sheets. It is our firm belief that this is a quite overlooked area of stress testing and liquidity management right now, because the regulatory pathways and the implied insurance increase costs will impact the business models and therefore the credit profiles of borrowers and create challenges for banks over the short to mid-term. Now, we know from various documents, from rules which already exist, that liquidity strategies have to be made to overcome potential impacts as they come along. And we also know that the Basel Committee, which tends to inform central banks around the world, has already included climate-related risks, transitional and physical, i.e. regulatory and the physical costs in their models. And this is already being picked up elsewhere in the world, notably across Africa and Europe. And it's actually making its way into reporting requirements in those two areas. At the same time, we have guidance which has been out, and we're now awaiting the feedback of that guidance from the Fed and the OCC as to how that's going to play out in the US. The interesting thing there, as we discussed last time, is that whilst it is guidance documents and discussion documents from a US perspective, they are based and they're more or less cut and paste exactly from the same Basel document that the ECB in Europe and various African central banks have adopted fairly much wholesale. The difference between this webinar and the last is in this one, will be introducing a solution that would allow participating banks to put a number on this, so we can actually look at what the impact on capital requirements would be and how that would break down across the balance sheet. So we're actually going to introduce GreenCap, the product, which is actively being launched next month, and we will be onboarding banks through September onto that platform. Okay, so what do we mean when we say that the policies are being unveiled and rolled out? Well, in short, we have the document that was released in February of 21, which reaffirmed targets and the aspirations, or the aims, actually more the aspirations, of the US government to the United Nations. This is a document that is supposed, according to the rules of that organization, to be updated on a fairly regular basis, with its aims being increased over time. So very much what we have in our hands now is the base case of what the government would aim to do. Now, the reason it's called the Nationally Determined Contribution, as I'm sure many of you already know, is because this is, each country submits its own plan. It's not really connected to any global ambition. It is just what that country will do, and they will typically name the sectors that they're going to try and achieve this with, along with the final aim from a climate perspective. In the US case, that is defined as cutting its greenhouse gas emissions. That's going to be CO2 or equivalent, nitrogen, methane, etc., to 50 to 52% below its 2005 level. This is the aim by 2030. So we know what that we know what they're trying to do, and we know that they are looking at 5 specific sectors as a means of achieving that aim. So we have a certain amount of information at hand, and we can treat that information as the base case for the decade that we're in. Now, at the same time, I mentioned Basel. This becomes important because almost all liquidity rules, credit risk, market risk, just about all risk management, it emanates from the Basel Committee, and the different countries will look to achieve Basel 1, 2, 3, upcoming 4 status by complying with a sufficient amount of those rules in terms of how they ask their financial community to communicate the risks that they're facing. It is interesting, like I said, that what is now out, and has been out for quite a long time, from the OCC, is basically that Basel document just put out for discussion in the US. That's exactly the same thing that happened in Europe, and now it's more or less being wholesale adopted by the ECB for its larger banks, and will be rolled out later across its banking sector. What does it really say? Well, it just gives 12 principles as to how we ought to be looking at the problem of the increasing risk profile in this situation. I picked out the 4 main ones here. There's a lot about governance and things like that, but the 4 main ones: incorporate finance-related financial risks, or climate-related financial risks, into internal control framework. Basically, it's saying subdivide the existing credit and liquidity, to a certain extent market, but there's less emphasis on that, and make a note of where there might be additional risks coming from that climate-related area. Understand the impact of climate-related risk drivers on the credit risk profile. This is interesting language, because this is now saying there are very specific forward-looking drivers. Now this has to do with the transition and the cost to underlying businesses and indeed households, which will directly impact their ability to maintain their credit profiles in reasonably good standing. That's going to have to do with the speed of implementation, going to have to do with any interruptions with that implementation path, as well as any physical direct physical effects that require fixing, there's something FERS that can be attributed to this, or what will be the increasing in costs of insurance against climate-related events. Now, it then goes on, that's the credit risk profile. But then it then says, those same drivers, how does that look at the liquidity risk profile? This is directly asking the question that if your current loan book, it's the way that you have structured your balance sheet is heavy on targeted industries. So let's take the agricultural sector, and all agricultural banks should be thinking about this quite significantly. In fact, the Environmental Defense Agency published a very good paper on this last year, or the year before even, on how the costs could go quite high if a business model is predicated on not resting fields, on use of nitrogen, on methane production. And those costs are going to be borne by the people who are responsible for funding that debt. And that's obviously on the credit profile. But not only is it on that, we have to look forward and say, what does that credit profile mean to us as a future liquidity position? That's exactly what this is asking. Let's take one step forward. We know that a liquidity crisis is born from a credit event or a number of credit events. What this is saying is there are likely to be a number of credit events and therefore a liquidity event coming out of that. Can we make contingencies for that? And the final point, which I think, if there's been a determined move for the last 30 years, really, for market risk, credit risk, and consequently liquidity risk to be somewhat stochastic in nature, where we use a whole host of past events to predict forward events. What we're now being asked to do is run forward quite specific scenarios, i.e. what happens if the NDC comes to fully into force, what happens if we stay on the current policies, that portion of the NDC which is encapsulated in the IRA, and what actually happens if they go further and they enhance their commitment to this in order to limit global warming to 2 degrees by the end of the century. Now, of course, when I say limit 2 degrees, what I mean is commit to policies that would, if that's all correct, limit that. That is a prescribed pathway. In order to do that, we have 2030 targets, we have 2050 targets. This is often what gets referred to as, the net zero journey. Banks will only be able to participate and thrive in this if their balance sheets are managed and monitored to take into effect this forward credit risk. So we know what metrics we need to modify. Most importantly, we need to look at the expected and unexpected credit loss model. This is, we could refer to these as the current CECL model, and in the US, IFRS 9 internationally. And we could look at the RWA, the risk-weighted asset calculations, in terms of the unexpected loss. But those two together are going to give us an idea of what our capital requirements would look like as we go along each and every one of these various pathways. We then have to say how much of those costs are coming from transition costs. That's the cost to comply with new regulations, to obey new environmental rules, or potentially pay fees or fines for not obeying those rules. And how much comes from physical costs, actual physical damage and or insurance costs. By putting those in specifically into the RWA calculation, and expanding that calculation so that we can make it slightly more granular, we get a natural recalibration of the risk rating. So we see a risk rating as a probability of default. We can use this model to imply what the new probability of default would be, and then replug that in and recalculate what the capital costs would be along very many different pathways. I'm just going to take a little short break there for a second before we move on to actually looking at the system itself.
All right, great. So we will do our first polling question. All right, so I'm going to want this here. You'll see it on your screen, but I'll read it as well. And the question is your institution currently including climate-related risk in its credit and liquidity planning? Answers being no, under discussion currently, limited reporting, or yes. And okay. Wait your answers for a second here. But I am seeing that the answer here is no. Okay. But we actually do not have any attendees today that are underway with this, which, isn't terribly surprising given the conversations that we've had. But I'm I guess glad that we're here to at least take a look at it. The results here. Let's see, everybody. Everybody was at no. Marcus, curious to get your take on that, or is that kind of fit your expectations too?
I'm surprised there wasn't more under discussion, but it's not terribly surprising that it's not included. As we go around having the conversations around this, my general sense is that it is being discussed, and I know that's why I'm surprised that it's not under discussion. But as at the moment, it's not actively being put into the frameworks, which I find it a little bit surprising, honestly, because there is a material risk which exists with or without the need to report it. And if it does become, which it did in Europe quite rapidly, a requirement, then I think it might be quite a difficult one to put in at short notice without a certain amount of planning, and there could become some surprises when those results are run and not properly calibrated. But okay, we will go on. Okay, so let's get to the heart of really what we're here to talk about. What do we mean by a viable climate scenario approach? Well, we know how the US government is costing out its plans. We know what they're doing because they published in March a paper that discussed the potential methodologies and the ways that this will be put in. Obviously, there's a physical effect, physical damage, as they put it, to the macroeconomy, and then there's one which looks at the macroeconomic effects of that overall transition. And they have a number of ways that go into that costing, and then they're putting that in the long-term budget assumptions as well as the shorter within 10-year budget assumptions. This is obviously so they can structure debt around that where necessary, but it's a process that they've published. And I think it's worth saying here that all the documents in this in this PowerPoint, which will be made available to all attendees, are linkable. So they're all linked to the underlying documents on the web, so you can go see what Basel is saying, you can go see what the US government is saying. But a key point here is that US methodology pretty much exactly matches what Basel have suggested and what's going on in the rest of the world as we speak. So how do we do that? Well, what we do in the system is we know from the target, from the way the targets are actually discussed, we can take that and we can map that to underlying industries. So we can say this transition cost, let's call it X for now, is going to be defrayed as a percentage. We know that GDP is a model of productivity for the whole economy. And so because we can say there's a lag of X, that lag is going to be targeted very specifically at certain sectors. And that could be agriculture, that could be the building sector and transportation. Those are three big ones which are actually very, very much at the fore of US policy making. From underneath those, we can pick out the secondary targets, which we can say correlate to that full cost at a lesser amount, let's say a 90% correlation. And there's even, in some areas, tertiary targets. This can even be done at state level if we want to. We can see where those additional rules are coming in. We know California has different rules to other states. And so it's possible that when you regionalize the country, you actually have these different numbers driving these. But it means that any existing loan that's tied to a certain sector, we know from the top down what the impact on that loan would be from an RWA perspective. Of course, that assumes there is no adaptations made. What we then do is fill in the numbers themselves. Because we can deconstruct the RWA calculation, we can break the economic part of that into a standard economic, a transitional, and a physical. These can be taken as lags against that. And then there's also a downturn. That's basically the value of the collateral underlying these loans. We can go and get data for this. And the plan is for Greenpoint to provide a base set of data that's been gone through and curated, both from the NDCs, from those targets, and also from the NGFS. We discussed this at length last time, but what this is, the net greening of the financial system, it is a collection of, I think it's 196 countries now contribute to it. It's mostly central bankers and economists, and they come out with estimates. And there's three key estimates that we're interested in here. There's many that are on the site. It's well worth looking at these. So it's a free data site, but they will look at the cost to GDP for various things, various impacts. Notable amongst those impacts, one is low, medium, and high damage estimates. What could that actually cost to fix, mitigate, insure against? And it will project that out way into the future. Now, obviously, we know it's going to change according to which pathways we go along and what happens. But for each of the potential pathways, let's say the current policies, the NDCs, they will have a number which has been crunched by very many analysts looking at this, and it's just about the most reliable data we can get for that. At the same time, now look at the transitional cost. What's going to be the economic lag of forcing businesses to spend more to do, yes, like a zero investment in many ways. It's the cost of being compliant with new environmental rules. And then interestingly, they do one more, which I think is worth paying attention to. And on this one, they look at the implied price of carbon per ton along each pathway at certain dates in the future. So what they're essentially doing there is to say, if you imagine the whole world as a gigantic capital trade system, that's where you would say there is a target that you're going for with your reduction in carbon release from CO2 or equivalent release. If you didn't meet that target and you had to buy those credits from somewhere else that did, sort of theoretical argument, if you had to do that, this is what that would cost. Now that cost equates very much with the transitional cost of meeting your own your own targets. So we do have quite a well-researched source of information that we can use, and we put this in for countries around the world, including the US and potentially regionally within the US. So we know we can get the data, that X that we were just talking about, that's going to be related to the transitional cost. That's no longer an X, that's now a number per scenario. So we can have a base level scenario, which is a current policy scenario. Then we can have an NDC scenario, a 2-degree scenario, or 1.5 degree scenario, and what's called a hothouse world scenario, where you literally don't implement anything at all. So you can have a fairly clear baseline of what the zero effort cost is to base everything else on. But it means we have numbers that we can fill in. But we're still not there, because that's very much a top-down approach to building a scenario. It only works top-down that way. But what we've put in also is the ability at the individual loan level to put adaptations in. So if there are businesses that exist on the balance sheet who've already invested in moving forward, and so as not to have this cost in the future, they already have gone to field resting, they've gone to less nitrogen, they've gone to less methane, they're using green concrete, they're using green steel, they've electrified their delivery fleet. There's a whole raft of measures that they can do. We can put those adaptations in, which will mean that that lag won't apply to that loan. They won't feel the brunt of that regulation. So we can actually see a bottom-up differentiation between those companies, those firms which are investing in rules that they know are already in formation as guidelines, and those that aren't until they absolutely have to do them. So we can do the top-down, well-researched and well curated data, and we can do the bottom-up by knowing what our customers are doing on around their businesses and their own net zero journey. That will give us then a complete picture, which when we put all together, it means we can build the scenarios in the system. It will come with scenarios in and the capacity for participating banks to put their own in as much as they want, which only they will see. There'll be a base set of US scenarios, which will cover the main outcomes, but they will have the capacity to put more in. What we'll then do is research those, and we will put the GDP impacts, we'll break that into physical and transitional, and we will put that in for each of the pathways. So the base data will be there. The supply chain, we actually have a way of correlating results, known relationships between industries, so that we can say if there's a target industry which is impacted, which is right in the crosshairs, then its supply chains will be hit by a certain correlation amount. That calculation is something that we have available and that we will just run through when portfolios are loaded up into the system. And then step 4 will be reporting. We will be putting in reporting for the overall economic capital. So we'll be saying the increase in required capital will be this much on a loan and balance sheet level. we can identify what within that scenario the implied default probability changes. Then we'll identify what the potential spread would be if along that scenario to make that, to prevent that loan becoming unprofitable. There's a certain kind of FTP type pricing function that goes on. So when we put all that together, we can get a complete balance sheet impact, which allows banks to analyze down by sector, by loan, by scenario, and by metric, and get a fairly full view that they can use as additional liquidity reporting on top of their normal, twists and shifts of what will happen to their capital charge in other circumstances. So I think with that in mind, before and the next section, we're going to look through the actual reporting screens and what goes on. But I think, Matt, maybe we ask a second question.
Yes. All right. Okay. So our second polling question, do you believe that your current ALM system could be extended to capture the regulatory reporting currently being discussed? Answers being no. Climate-related complexities are outside of its input parameters, possibly, but it would require significant changes. Should be possible, or you just have. Well, you're ready. A second answer here. It's like leaning towards attendees have not discussed this yet. Very moment. Okay, so yeah, that looks like that's I think all the answers we're going to get here, and the answer we're seeing is that it hasn't been discussed. I guess given the previous poll, maybe that's not terribly shocking, but obviously, I guess kind of the next logical question, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. It's not surprising given the problem itself is not necessarily at the forefront. I actually think this second question, though, may become the more pressing one, and it very much has to do with how the credit and liquidity measures are done and how backward looking versus forward looking and what kind of metrics can go in. I think it's tricky to extend an existing system which calculates these things, because what you don't necessarily want to do is change the whole basis on which you do your RWA calculation on a what if at the end of the liquidity contingency plan. And at the same time, if you don't change that underlying calculation to allow the transition to physical, you won't get to the answer. So, one way that we are looking at that, because that was the kind of feedback we got from banks at the very beginning of the process of building the system, but it was tough to do that. So what we're looking to do is to really calculate against what you could call a base version of RWA and a accepted form of the expected credit loss. We can use a discounted cash flow method for what it's worth to recalculate CECL. Now, the reason for doing it that way is we will compute with and without the green effect. So the only thing we aim to feed back is what the increase will be against those two methodologies. So we kind of wash out the necessity of having to extend an existing system, some of which could have been in place for 20 years and could be largely spreadsheet based. It could just be very difficult to execute. Okay, let's move on and take a look at the reporting screens and see where we actually get to. Okay, so everything now we're going to look at is what the output of the system would be. First of all, we're always going to provide a dashboard, which is going to allow you to highlight through various heat maps which sectors, which individual borrowers are going to cost the most in terms of economic capital. Now, you might notice that that's along the top, it's all economic capital, scenario economic capital, and then the loan book will go loan by loan and say, this is the increase in the spread, this is the decrease in the default probability, this is the expected loss, the unexpected loss for each scenario. And then that will get summarized in the middle. But along the bottom, we have this thing, disclosures. Now, the reason for this is because at the same time as Basel is concerning itself with how you report potential credit and liquidity, there are certain requirements coming through for banks to essentially audit their balance sheets so they can see how much, it's actually referred to as scope 3 disclosures, how much CO2 emission they are financing. This data is not very good, honestly. There are a number of ways which it can get distorted by the emitters, but it is quite likely to form part of a reporting package at some point in the future. The reason I've included it here on these dashboards is to illustrate the fact that there is a difference between what CO2 gets emitted in this finance and which CO2 emitters would get impacted by policy. The policy won't simply say CO2 is bad. It will say in a certain sector, we expect this reduction or this behavior. So you will get a skew, a differential between where the observed emittance is and where the credit and liquidity risk comes from. Now, I personally believe that that piece of information will become one of the most important pieces of information when all of this gets reported. Because there may well be no point in a bank changing what it finances if what it's financing is not under any kind of target. Notably, the energy production in this country, in the US, is less targeted, I would argue, than agriculture and transportation. Now, obviously, energy production, if you look at it from a pure disclosure perspective, would come quite high, but it actually will become lower in the US in terms of regulatory change. So the reason we put those on is so that we can have a full picture of what it looks like from an optics perspective, a what are we financing, and what it actually is from a credit and liquidity risk perspective. That makes sense to everyone. Okay, so what do we actually need to comply with the regulations as they are being rolled out elsewhere and as they are being discussed within the US? And let's call it the foundation for best practice. Well, there's 5 things that we need. We need the capacity to do multiple scenarios. We need a reliable data source. It needs to fit in with the reporting we currently do. It was discussed for a while, but it's been more or less dropped as an idea to have it as a standalone reporting element. What they want to know how much additional credit risk, how much additional liquidity risk, even on the market risk that will roll through. But as I said, there's kind of less focus on that. It has to fit with the current methodology. It has to have a transitional and physical element to it so that they can see, are we talking about a kind of a meteorological scenario, or are we talking about a regulatory scenario? And it has to, in the reporting, as well as the methodology being in line, it has to get reported in line with that standard credit liquidity reports, which are fairly well understood. What we can see from this first screen that we look at, two of those in terms of putting the standard methodology and reporting, the system will bring you into line with immediately. What we then look at is, if you recall when we went through how we would build a scenario, what that would actually look like, you can see that we use the most credible pricing, which we get from the NGFS, and we break it into its transitional and physical climate change impact. So this is where we are taking the right data from the right source and applying it to that methodology and reporting style. And then finally, whenever we run the system, we will always run multiple scenarios. So you'll always have the base case, which is going to be the current case. If what's in the policy statute right now is as far as they go, then this is the increase in risk that we're going to be facing. At the same time, you'll get other reports sitting alongside that, which will say for this pathway, then those numbers will change in this way. So you'll get a different value for the transition, a different value for the physical, and different computed economic capital impact. But if we then think past that Basel document, and we think, how do we use this as an institution? How do we plan around this? Well, for that contingency liquidity planning, we would need some extra metrics. We would need to be able to identify mispriced loans and where we expected the default probabilities to change. What we'd also need is the ability to do what-if analysis and to set targets so that we can put this into our risk governance framework, and we can toggle those targets as we see things becoming clearer, through time. Well, the good news is part of the extension of the system is it will naturally pick up the loan spreads and the default probability changes. It will report that by loan on the first screen, and then through other reporting screens as you explore the system, you will see that you'll get those results put right in. We have a section where you can set targets, and you can set these targets by credit score buckets, because we know lower credit scores, as we start to reach the 700 threshold, and the default probabilities would increase significantly. It might be that we want less sensitivity to the transition in those areas, so we can set targets there. We can set targets geographically, and we can set targets by industrial sector. Again, this is so we can match up not so much with disclosures on an audit, but with government policy and who it's going to impact. Where do we want to be less sensitive? And we would express that in a brown to dark green way. This does not reflect a kind of, if you want to call it this, it doesn't reflect an environmental sense of brown to dark green. It reflects a sensitivity to the specific policy. So if your sector, no matter what you actually emit in terms of CO2 or methane or anything else, if that sector is not a targeted sector, then that under the way we would characterize this would not be considered a brown industry, because this is a sensitivity measure. Now, what we really want is to look at those sectors where we know what those policies are, and make sure that our balance sheets are skewed in those impacted sectors more towards the dark green, i.e. the either positively correlated or insensitive to that policy change. That will keep that economic capital from increasing unnecessarily. And then finally, in terms of actually planning what happens if we put new loans in or out of the portfolio? Specifically, if we sell batches of loans and kind of clean the balance sheet that way. One of the things that we can do is put those theoretical trade baskets in and see where that moves us towards or away from our targets. So once we've done all of that, we can be fairly happy that we are going to satisfy the reporting regulations that Basel have kind of successfully pushed into Africa, Europe, and are in the process of pushing into the US. But really more importantly, we actually have additional tools now that we can use to manage the credit and liquidity profile as we move forward. And that's pretty much where we end looking at the system. I hope that's given you a flavor of what we're making available. I think it's important to say that we would imagine that it would take less than 2 or 3 weeks for certainly for most community banks with the tools we have and the other systems that we have. We would estimate it would take between 2 and 3 weeks to onboard a client so that they could actually run this as part of their monthly reporting. And it should give them the things that they need to manage that liquidity. And again, I'm going to kind of call back to the first webinar we did last month of what it means to do this thing right. Obviously, it's a journey, and things are going to change as we move along. But from multiple scenarios, proper analysis, putting it in line with understood and accepted risk methodology, breaking it into what we've been asked to, the transitional and the physical, being able to do bottom-up adaptations as well as top-down analysis means that we're not going to miss the fine details, or we're not going to miss the opportunity to tweak our results. And from that, we should be able to get expected, unexpected capital estimates per scenario, default probabilities per scenario, new spreads of how underpriced we might well be. And we should be able to integrate all of that into our standard reporting package. And before we go to questions, I'm just going to put it out there that we are launching these hubs in September. The idea of these, it should be an easy implementation. It should be a fairly simple way of putting the balance sheet up. The information being used for the scenarios will be extremely transparent, and there'll be opportunities for banks to create as many of their own scenarios as they want, really. And once the hubs are up in September, we will be working on a 6-month program of getting feedback to see what additional analysis would be useful, what additional reports would be useful, so that we can build out the system over that. Will be, if you like, we'll be handing the development slate to the impacted users so that we can build something that not only tells them what we think they need to know, but as that evolves along that 6-month line, gets them exactly where they need to be. I think with that, maybe Matt, we can see if there's any questions from anybody.
All right, great. Okay, well, right up here. Okay, first question that we have is just how reliable and available is the data to feed this kind of model?
I think that kind of goes back to how reliable we believe the NGFS. Now, I'm going to say that the reliability of this, what will be very difficult to ever do is backtest. Because in the end, we're going to follow a specific pathway. And so the others are going to become discarded. And every year, there's a new set of data out. But we have to say, okay, well, if we start here, if we miss a target this year, that target doesn't go away. That target just gets shifted into the future. So the pathway gets recalibrated, it gets repriced. There is such a massive amount of factors that go into it that to a certain extent, I wouldn't trust some of the lowest level data to run deep analysis. But I think once we get to the GDP impacts itself, I think it's reasonably reliable. It comes from a fairly good source. And given that it's for really contingency planning, I think that it's fit for purpose where it currently stands. As long as you get it from the NGFS and you understand the methodology that they've used to generate it, all of which is available on their site, and it's fairly freely available information.
Okay, great. And then that's all linked in the ebooks, if I remember.
Yeah. In fact, it's worth saying, I'm glad you reminded me. For everyone on the call, each one of the books you see in front of you is linked and available free on our website. It's just a series. Each one is a series of articles that we've been writing over the last couple of years, which discusses in depth some of the elements that go into the likely credit and liquidity impact, where they come from, and what some of the terminology means, and it just kind of eases the understanding a little bit. So if you want to click on any of those when you receive the PDF of this deck, then feel free, and there will be the books are there to download. Was there another question, Matt?
I had myself on mute here. Yes. Well, next question was, where does this risk reporting go in the next 4 or 5 years?
That's really the main question. And I think that the best way to answer that and think about it is, if we look at how market risk and credit risk reporting went in the let's say the 1990s, for market risk and credit risk in the 2000s, we began with a market risk case with a parametric bar being fairly available by 1993. By the end of that decade, we were talking still about moving to Monte Carlo. It's still quite rare, but most places have moved to a kind of a historic bar. It becomes a function of the data that's needed to feed models, and the format of that data and what those models are will start to determine where that goes in terms of what's been asked. One thing's for sure, it will always be deterministic, in the sense that there will be a choice of potential futures, and there's no real sense in talking of an average when you talk about two very different pathways. It doesn't really tell you anything useful. So it's always going to look more like a form of climate-related CCAR than it is going to look like a PFD type calculation, for those people who follow credit risk quite a lot. But I believe it will evolve, but I think the requirement will be those that we went over, those 5 requirements, and the actual reporting will probably be something which is just part of the standard reporting package by the end of that 5-year period, certainly by 2030.
Fair. Well, we're at the end of the hour. I want to try to sneak in one more question before we let everybody go if we can. I mean, that goes through just about how sensitive this is to the political climate.
Very. It's a good question. You could probably have a whole different session on that one question alone. Probably I would say the US has a highly kind of sensitive. It's almost binary, because most countries where they've put some places in place that will act as the baseline. With the US, it is obviously possible that that baseline disappears and things get rolled back, even from where they are. And it's, it would be equally possible that we could leave again the Paris Agreement, which would nullify any commitment made in the NDC. Going the other way, it would put you full bore on to completing the rollout of the policies required to meet that NDC. So I would say that it's super sensitive as to what that is. And I would also probably say that that's actually a very good reason to understand just the gap in between what those outcomes could look like in terms of what the credit and liquidity space will be at.
Okay. Well, I'll make sure that we get back to everybody else, for the questions that we didn't make it to, but I know that we're at the end of the hour, so we better wrap it up. I want to thank everybody again for joining us and taking the time. I look forward to following up with everybody to hear feedback. I'll send you an email and we'll make an effort to try to catch some people on the phone too, if you're open to it, and we look forward to continuing this conversation with everybody.
Right. Thanks, Matt, and thanks everybody for joining.